Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here. Welcome to another installment of Pedal Head. Today's pedal of interest, or bean as it were, is the original Line 6 pod. And I'm going to forego my introductory speech about this as I usually would, because I've covered this product in excruciating detail in its own Gear Curiosities episode. So if you want a real deep dive into what this thing does on the face of the product and just overall tone samples, you can go watch that video. And if you're still interested, you can always come back and see how this fares versus the world, because that's what we're doing today. Real quickly, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the pod segment of Line 6's products. This is their desktop amp modeling series. It's gone all the way up through the HD series, but this is version 1.0 that came out in 1998. You have a total of 16 amp models that is accessible from the hardware itself. You've got all the basic amp controls, reverb effects, you got some time-based effects like delay and chorus, tremolo, flanger, even a compressor, and you can save all that stuff in multiple banks and presets. But there's actually a few more tricks up this thing's sleeve that we did not access in the Gear Curiosities show. What I did not explore in that video are the MIDI capabilities of this device. You see, the Pod 2.0 actually has a firmware upgrade that allows you to access 16 more amp models from the face of this device. You hold the tap tempo button, you can select an alternate amp model other than what's actually named here. So you get stuff like a Mark II C+ drive channel. I think they've even got an alternate Soldano model, stuff like that. And then also holding that hold button, you can enable stuff like a drive boost, a distortion in front, turn on multiple effects at the same time you otherwise wouldn't be able to, but you simply can't do that with the firmware and the hardware that's installed on the 1.0. And I checked just to make sure this is indeed running off of 1.4 firmware, so no luck for me. However, we're not completely out of luck yet, because you can actually download some ancient software called Sound Driver, and using a compatible MIDI interface, chuck a MIDI cable into the input of this, and you can make all sorts of edits that you otherwise cannot do on the face of this unit, including like a dozen more amplifier models you can't access. You can change the cabinet modeling, so you can have like a Marshall V30 sound versus the stock impulse response that is used with the Rectifier. So lots of good stuff, lots of sounds you otherwise can't get just with straight editing on this thing. And therefore, all the sounds you're hearing will be made through that software. And I'll show you the screenshot of what those settings are. And if you have a 1.0, you can actually download the presets. I'll have those on the Google Drive for you if you'd like, and use the same software. You can import it. It's a little finicky, it's not quite Axe Edit. It's not a modern, Line 6 Helix editor, but it does work. So that's how we're going to be getting all the sounds you're hearing today. We're going to be shooting this device out with a number of contemporary digital modeling solutions, including our standby Fractal Audio AX8 to represent kind of a more modern take on what this does. We'll be using the Moore micro preamp line to represent that company, as well as the Radar for some impulse response loading at times. And then we'll break out some Boss Effects pedals for some of the time-based effects like reverb, delay, and chorus. Because of how dissonant the group of Shootout attendees today is, I'm going to have to forego my usual little preamble about showing what all settings sound like on the pedal and kind of getting a preliminary image of what to expect in the upcoming shootouts, because it's just not going to happen. Even the most like-for-like sounds, it's just, I could be here all day. We're all year more accurately adjusting knobs on this thing alone, and then you get into problems like noon on this device doesn't sound like noon on the other one. It's just useless. So instead of that, I'm going to give you just a brief preface of my expectations for this video, what I went into this thinking, what I'm trying to achieve, and basically warn you about what you're going to hear and not going to hear. Of course, being the scatterbrain that I am, I had to type this out so I wouldn't forget any important points. And as good as my eyesight is, I simply can't read it from the camera stand, so I'm going to hold paper like a moron. So first warning is that this is the least scientific pedal head to date. It may be the least scientific pedal head ever, because as I went through these tests, I realized, wow, there is no way you can isolate all the variables that I want to isolate. For instance, with the overdrive stuff, we had the exact same amp, exact same DI signal, all the settings were like for like on each of the pedals. That way you could hear, okay, that part of the circuit's doing this. This has an inherent flubby sound going on here. So it's really consistent. You could tell what each pedal was doing. Not the case with this because, as I said, there's just stuff that's too different. So I physically cannot isolate everything. I don't have the time to do so. And again, stuff like noon across all devices isn't useful. It doesn't paint the whole picture, and they're all using different modeling technologies. So it's super hard to get a consistent theme throughout all the devices we're using. With that in mind, I'm not trying to make one product sound worse than the other or one better than the other. This is simply the results of me screwing around with these settings for 15-20 minutes at a time on each device and getting something that I think sounded close to the others, you know, close enough to demonstrate, but also that represented that product well. So I'm not going to dumb down, you know, say a Moore pedal to sound like the Pod to make it closer. I'm also, you know, not going to try to EQ them exactly alike. I'm just getting a sound that I like out of each one. Sounds I like obviously encompasses the individual control settings on whatever we're looking at, but that also means I'm not going to be looking at every amplifier under the hood. I only have so many like for like pedals and effects to test. So we're going to be doing a handful of amps. We're going to be doing a handful of effects and stuff. So you're not going to see probably everything you want to see. Sorry, I physically can't. I'm doing things that ultimately I wanted to see out of this video, and you know, I can't compare against a JCM 800 or Plexi style pedal circuit that I don't have. Simple as that. So I would save the comments about, well, you should have done it this way because I wanted to hear it that way. Sorry, this is the way it turned out. This is the best I think I could have done with what I had, and it's ultimately what I wanted to see. So you're going to be hearing some Boogie amps, and you're not going to be hearing, you know, Soldano. That's just the way it is. This video took literally days of work for even the 6 or so minutes of test clips you're hearing, because that was like, I don't know, 40 minutes of clips that's edited down, and I could have gone on for several more days and more configurations, but the way it turned out, and it is what it is. Furthermore, my analysis on the products at the end of the day are going to be on the products themselves. If you feel personally attacked because I've said something regarding, oh, I think this pedal sounds like shit compared to this, or this is obviously a drop in quality versus this product, I'm sorry, that's on you. I'm not personally attacking anyone, and you like what you like, and that's fine. You know, I completely respect that. I 100% respect that there's going to be people out there that, you know, maybe are using either something like a Pod, something that's older, and that works for them, and they're cool with it. They physically can't hear the quality difference or simply don't care. And again, that's totally cool. I would ask in return you respect those that do care and that can hear that quality difference, because that's why you're here in this video, right? Otherwise, a gear shootout's kind of pointless if you don't care about the sound difference. So please spare the toxic comments from either side about, you know, grandpa guitar tones or tone is in the fingers or whatever it is. Ultimately, this video is supposed to be a fun exercise in hearing what, you know, something like that sounds like to something a little more contemporary. But I've seen the way these videos go. They get toxic quick, and I just wanted to get that out of the way. So just don't be a dickhead is the moral of the story. So let's get started with the clean amp shootout. This is using the Mark II-C Plus clean model on the Pod, as well as an appropriate 2x12 Fender style impulse response for the cabinet. No effects. We'll be putting it up against the Mark III clean channel on the Moore 008, as well as the Moore Radar, since the stock impulse response on the preamp stuff doesn't change, so I needed a 2x12 impulse response for that. And then we'll be using the USA clean on the Fractal AX8, as well as another appropriate 2x12. No post EQ, completely raw guitar tone, and because this is a Mark series amp, we're not using any EQ in terms of the 5-band that happens after the preamp section. This is all flat, and basically as apples to apples as it's going to get. I personally didn't dislike any of those sound samples, though that does start to highlight a couple of the drawbacks with the older pod modeling technology. For me, the AX8 was the most authentic compared to my actual Mark IV clean channel, and it retained a lot of that high-end detail I love from a good sparkly, spanky Fender sound. The Moore through the 2x12 IR that was stock on the Radar was a little woody, a little boxy for my taste, but still competent. It's something that I wouldn't feel uncomfortable using, but that's a problem I kind of have on a lot of the built-in impulse responses that are on the Moore Radar, and you'll hear that as the test progresses. But with the pod, I like the sound. I really like the gain structure. I like the feel of the amp, and it was, fine playing through it. But the problem is you can kind of hear, number one, it is a little noisy compared to newer technology. It really didn't matter how much you crank the output level or the drive. It's pretty much there, though it is muted with a decent noise gate that is, comes pre-installed on this device. But also a lot of the high-end details cut off. That probably has something to do with the sampling rate of this device. I don't think it's a full, 44 1 kilohertz. I believe it's under 40,000, so they probably had to cut off a little bit, both due to their modeling algorithms as well as just frequency aliasing. So that's something you'll hear throughout the rest of the tests. Some noise, some loss in high-end detail, but otherwise, competent clean sound. I would have no problem putting this through a powered, FR, or through the effects loop of a solid state amp if I was trying to get some more sounds. It's very doable, and for 20 years old, not bad at all. The next test involves the Mark II C+ drive channel, also accessed over MIDI on the pod. We'll be using a appropriate 4x12 impulse response here. We'll be using the same 008 pedal from Moore, except the onboard 4x12 IR on that pedal, and the USA 2C+ model on the AX8 with a 4x12 once again. This test highlights that problem I was talking about earlier about dragging all the other products down to the lowest common denominator, because I absolutely hate the sound of a 2C+, Mark III, Mark IV, Mark V lead channel without the use of the 5-band EQ. And I didn't use it on the AX8 because this doesn't have it. The tone stack on the Moore 008 pedal is not the same sort of effect that is on the actual Mark series of amplifiers, so none of them sounded the best they could have, except for the Line 6 pod, in my opinion. And I was fairly impressed with not only the sound quality. It's not great, it's boxy by comparison, but definitely usable. And what I was really impressed by this, that even the Moore fails to capture, is the EQ works exactly the same way that it would on an actual Mark amp, because it's not your traditional tone stack, it's actually a pre-gain stage. So it's like having a clean boost in front of an amp where you can tweak the bass, middle, and treble frequencies on your actual guitar before it gets amplified. So it's kind of a cool thing to see that implemented 21 years ago at this point. And I thought the raw sound from that was obviously less scratchy, not as ice picky compared to the AX8, but if I'd used the 5-band EQ, that would have been solved. I like the sound a lot from the Moore, but it doesn't sound authentic Mark series because of that, since they just tied all of that functionality into a straight gain, bass, middle, treble control, and didn't sound great. Though I did like the frequency spectrum. I like how it's set, in your ears. In my book, it's kind of hard to name a winner in that test since we didn't use the other two devices to their full advantage, but in a like-for-like scenario, I think the Line 6 pod did pretty damn well, and it's pretty interesting that they were able to capture that sort of minutia in amp modeling when it was kind of still at its infancy at that point. For test number 3, we're checking out one of the old standbys for high gain sounds on the pod, the rectified model, and this is indeed the one you can access on the faceplate, although we will be using a different impulse response that we'll have to edit through MIDI. We're not using an overdrive because unfortunately the drive boost and distortion doesn't do the same thing on this that I like to do with regular tube screamers or super overdrives. That doesn't do the whole clean boost with the tilt EQ type thing. So it's going to sound worse across all devices than it should, but there will be upcoming tests where we do use overdrives, so you can hear that use case as well. For this, we are simply seeing how good does the rectifier model sound. And of course, we'll be using the Moore 011 in this case with the stock IR, as well as the Recto 1 Red model on the AX8 with a rectifier 4x12 impulse response, I believe Recto new mix, if I remember correctly. See how that sounds. It shouldn't be surprising at this point that the pod is once again lacking some of that high-end detail we hear on the Moore and AX8 implementations, though I think the pod actually, in terms of gain structure, kind of sounds more like a rectifier than the Moore does without a boost pedal. Now, stuff does change once you add a tube screamer up front, and that's why I basically always run boost in front of the Moore implementations, but this wasn't bad. The cabinet impulse response is completely decimating all of that high frequency detail past like 4,000 hertz, which is why it sounds muffled by comparison to the AX8. But it was chunky. It was still somewhat articulate compared to the boxy nature of the Moore. And it's no wonder that was such a used amp model at the time. Now, some of you might be thinking at this point, why the hell wouldn't I use a third-party impulse response for the cab section to eliminate that extra variable? That way we can actually focus on what the amp modeling is doing, because a lot of that high frequency roll off is no doubt coming from the cabinet on the Line 6 pod. And that boils down to two main reasons. The first point, and it's kind of minor in comparison to the second, is that as we found on the standalone Gear Curiosities video, this thing doesn't pair all that well with modern impulse responses. I think it's because the cab IRs and the amp models were sort of designed for each other. They just don't react all that well. This sounds very flat by comparison. It appears a lot of the dynamics is actually built into the cabinet section, which is why when you flip it to the direct sound, it kind of gets a more boomy, more scooped, versus if you do the amp mode and run it through something like a solid state amp, it sounds a bit flatter, but still fine. The second and more important point is you can't load third-party impulse responses on this thing. That's a long way away from the original pod. We didn't start seeing that for a couple more generations. And in order to use those, you'd have to load them into a third-party VST plugin or have a loader pedal like the Radar or something from AMT. And you're just not going to use it like that. That's not what this is designed for. So the tests are designed to be, how would I actually use the product? Because it's a cool, I guess, scholarly exercise to see exactly how well the amp modeling compares to newer stuff. But if you can't actually use it that way with everything that's presented under the hood of this thing, then it's kind of useless. So that's why we did different impulse responses for each. Again, this is less scholarly, less scientific than the others, and just kind of the nature of the beast when you're talking about tech this old that is in the digital realm. These next tests, however, will be a little more like for like. We'll have basically all the pertinent variables isolated because we'll be using the same amp and cab model on the Line 6 pod each time, because now we're going to listen to some effects both on the pod as well as external. We'll be running through the effects loop of the AX8 for its reverb, delay, and chorus models, and we'll be using the Boss pedals for a stomp box equivalent. So first we're going to start with a clean room reverb sound, and this is something that on the pod you actually can't change on the face. Again, we're going to have to change this in the editor. It's kind of a one model of reverb per one model of amp. So stuff like the, say the Class A amp or the small Tweed, that will have stuff like the spring reverb model, but modern amps, high gain stuff will have the room. However, you can modify that in the editor. So we'll be sticking with the same clean model here and checking out the room reverb as is, about as stock as you can get it on each different device. There's not much not to like on any of those samples, though this is another case where getting each product to sound similar while, being adequately represented was definitely a challenge. You have a lot more variables to edit on something like Axe Edit versus Sound Driver, and you've only got 4 knobs to turn on the actual pedal. But overall, they all sounded like room reverbs to me. The AX8 being the most, I think, mellow, most pleasant to hear for me, though it actually didn't have as much stereo width that I liked out of the Boss reverb. Very impressed with that. I still love that pedal every time I plug it in. It's a little brighter, a little, again, more stereo width to it, but this one was not bad at all. Compared to the other ones, you don't have as much high frequency, kind of content going on, but that's not really something you need with room reverb for me. With the AX8, you have some roll off going on, and because of that, the Boss pedal sort of sounds artificial, but it's all pleasant. It all sounds really good. So I'm still impressed with a lot of the onboard effects, and the reverb is definitely one of those with the Line 6 pod. So let's see if that translates to the spring reverb, doing the same thing with some tweak settings across the board, except the using the spring setting on the RV5 and the spring model with, I believe, the medium spring on AX8. Once again, some pretty good sounds all around, though I'd have to throw my hat towards the AX8 once again for authenticity. That's the sort of sound I think of when playing through spring amps. It definitely sounds the most like the amps I've had with spring reverb. Not a huge fan of that for a lot of stuff, but the pod held up well, and it also kept in line with that sort of subtle high frequency roll off that does sound more realistic. Though I love the sound of the Boss pedal. It's less realistic, more ambient, spacey sounding, but it works. And of course, you can change that if you absolutely have to have that sound. But these effects have aged pretty well on this thing, surprisingly, and they've no doubt only gotten better on newer implementations from what I've heard out of the Helix products and whatnot. But very usable, especially for cleans. Let's see if that holds up with the delay model. We'll be using an overdriven type of sound for this one, since that's generally what I use delays for, and be checking out with the Boss DD7 and the stereo digital delay model on the AX8. Not a bad showing for the pod once again, and surprisingly, I think my favorite out of the bunch was actually the DD7. I find that, at least in the stock configuration, without having to dive too deep in a lot of the variables that are on Axe Edit, I really like the ping pong effect from the DD7 better than the stock ping pong settings on the AX8, at least in digital stereo. That doesn't go with the multi-delay block or any of the other things that you can tweak under there, but really like the DD7. Very high resolution. Getting, by the way, the time that close was an absolute bitch, because I could dial in however, you know, microseconds of difference I wanted, milliseconds actually of difference on the AX8 I wanted, translating that to sound driver, and especially on analog controls, not so easy. So apologies for the ping pong delay difference, but I think you get the point. Either way, very high resolution stuff coming out of the DD7. Not bad for the pod. It does, by comparison, you know, sound a little muffled, but it doesn't sound artifacty. It's not like a obviously fake effect. It's, you know, not something you notice and think, oh, that's a terrible sounding delay. No, it actually works. You can't get the advanced feedback parameters and all the stuff that I like to dive into, but very usable, ridiculously usable for, once again, its age. And I don't think it's any secret why Line 6's dedicated delay pedals that came around that time and after were so popular, because they did such a good job. So let's round out the effects testing with Chorus 2. I find this a little less flangery, more of what I expect out of a chorus on the pod. As such, we'll be using the Super Chorus from Boss and the digital stereo model from the AX8. Who would have thought in a chorus shootout that my least favorite chorus sound would come from a pedal whose sole existence it is to make chorus sounds? The pod held up really well. I very much like the chorus sounds out of this. It's not that over flangery phaser type of garbage that I hate for clean stuff. That can sound good on leads and driven sounds, but for what I want out of it, does a very good job. My favorite choruses on the AX8 are the Roland Dimension derivatives, but for a standard stereo digital, it's obviously huge and lush, and I very much like it. For the Super Chorus, I bought that chorus because it's not all that much of a chorus, actually. It's better at stereo widening, which is why I wanted it. And if I had a different stereo pedal for it, then I would have used it, but that's my one stereo chorus pedal. So it works for what I want it to do, but if you're going for that sort of rich, luscious sound we demonstrated with this, then you're not going to get it out of that. And in that way, very impressive results here. And with a few little tweaks to depth and rate, you can get some good stuff out of Sound Driver. And even, I gotta say, the stock effects, just using tap tempo and mixing it in and using what's on the front panel, get some really good stuff out of it. So the time-based effects, definitely impressive for a 21-year-old bean at this point. Now for our final two tests, this is basically no holds barred, you know, just pair everything we can and see what kind of sounds we can get out of it for a couple famous pod users that I very much like. So first of which will be the Meshuggah sound. They use Line 6 Pod Pros, both touring and in the studio, before the original release of the Nothing album, as well as, you know, tour supporting that album until they got the Veta 2 amps. They ended up boosting their pods with Clean Boost from TC Electronic, so we're going to be doing the same on all of these different devices with something that resembles that. We'll be using the TC Spark on here, we'll be using the More Pure Boost with the More stuff, and we'll be using Tilt EQ that does basically the same thing on the AX8. And because it's, you know, kind of late 90s, early 2000s Meshuggah, we're going to be using the Rectifier models and a Genty scoop sounding cab model on each one of these. Though none of those samples were too much of a far cry from a lot of the bootleg audio recordings and the initial release of Nothing from that time period, it's pretty obvious that the Meshuggah guys used a lot of post EQ to get the sounds they were getting, because none of the cab models out of the box on this thing sound completely right. The one I ended up choosing does have the modern metal thump and the big scoop out of it, and it worked pretty well for extended range guitars, but it still needs a lot of doctoring to sound right. So it's usable, obviously, but I think I still preferred even the Moore sound. It's kind of gravelly sounding. It's even almost more artificial in some ways, but it worked, I think. And the AX8 sounded okay. It's not even as good as it can sound, though that kind of stuff takes a lot more work, and end up choosing things that I normally wouldn't to get it to sound that way. But yeah, I mean, it's no wonder that several contemporary metal artists use the original Pod and the Pod Pro to make a lot of music that still stands up today in some pretty cool tones. It's just not the sort of clarity and articulation and that just overwhelming tube-driven overdrive that we associate with a lot of contemporary acts and tones. So it definitely has its niche, but it's not what I want personally. And I much prefer the later Veta 2 and Axe Effects and even Cubase plugin sounds that came on later Meshuggah albums. For the final test, we were throwing all the effects into the mixing pot: overdrives, amp modeling, delay, and reverb, to attempt to achieve a similar tone to Devin Townsend's release of Ziltoid, the Omniscient, and he used Pod XTs for that record, so a little bit later advances in amp modeling compared to the original Pod, but should be able to get some similar stuff out of this. And we'll be using all the onboard effects with this, paired with a Tube Screamer Mini to drive it. With the real pedals, we're going to be combining all of those, and then of course the AX8 will have its own Tube Screamer model, and the drive block and everything else will be kind of the stuff you've already heard. Can't say that any of those samples sounded dead on Ziltoid, but they all sort of resemble one era or another of Devin Townsend's work, which I think is speaking highly of all products involved. And it's no real wonder that, he used the Pod Tech on his rock opera album, because you can get that sort of stuff even on the previous gen stuff. I'm sure the XT sounds better in the high frequencies, and probably, there's some post-processing going on there, but, it resembles it. It's boomy in the lower frequencies, a little boxy, and the AX8 kind of covers that frequency spectrum perfectly for me. It's like, that's the boosted, processed rectifier sound I love. Of course, the effects are out of this world good, but this really works really well. Compared to the standalone delay, reverb, stomp boxes we took a look at, not nearly as versatile and not quite as high res sounding, but I don't think anyone that's not a guitar player is really going to notice the difference. That's the God's honest truth from my point of view. So to conclude this mad experiment that was this video, I've actually gained a new appreciation for the Pod even after the last piece of content I did on it, because on its own, in a vacuum, it sounds pretty good. And playing along to the albums, the kind of tones I was trying to get, it really kind of melted into the mix and it sounded fine. It's only, when comparing it to modern stuff, you think, oh, well, obviously that sounds better, but it's really hard to complain about considering how old it is, and it's just a fine product. I think there's a faction on both sides of the spectrum where you've got one end that's just completely shitting on the Pod series. It's probably never really spent a lot of time with it, and saying it's completely trash, whether it be the first generation or the newest. And then you've got, on the other side, people that put this thing up on a pedestal that say, well, it sounds like it does because it's your fault. It's all in the artist's hands. It's all, You know, you can make anything sound as good as a $4,000 half stack or whatever, and it's just not the case. The reality of the situation is it lies somewhere in between. It's a good product, and it obviously has a legacy, but when you view it through the lens of modern sound quality and kind of the tones we're after in this day and age, it's okay, you know, and I think that's where it lies today. It's all right for what it is. Some people won't want to hear that, I guess. The question is, can I recommend the Line 6 Pod in 2019? I mean, not really. For very specific cases, if you just need something to plop on your nightstand and jam in your bedroom every now and then, yeah, I mean, it's fine for 60 to 70 bucks like I paid for it. If you get the 2.0, you got more features. You can access a lot of that stuff that I had to do over MIDI. And it's right at your fingertips, and it becomes a pretty good value proposition. The problem is, good luck finding one. The stock continues to dwindle every year on the number of people that are selling it, and it's one of those cases of value where you can spend just a little bit more and get a lot more for your dollar. But you know, the spirit of the pod, of the original, lives on in plenty of other products. Hell, you can get the V amp from Behringer that's basically a copy of this thing, and it's supposed to sound all right for what it is, for like $100. And then of course, if you're actually serious about getting recording tones or want something to play with a band with, then you got stuff like the more GE200 multi-effects unit that houses a lot of the same tones we're getting out of the micro preamp line. Obviously fractal audio is a bit up there in price and therefore becomes a little harder for like-to-like comparisons. But you know, it is a competitor to the Helix line. You got the HX Stomp, which, as I talked about in the last video, is actually pretty close in price when you account for inflation to what this thing costed new. So you can get a lot more for your money compared to what this thing was new. But it's, I think it's still interesting to take a look at and see how far we've come in some ways and how little progress had to be made in others. I guess if I had to sum everything up in a couple of sentences, I would say you'd be hard-pressed to find more than a handful of products that can compete with this in terms of cost, in terms of how many features are there, being stereo, having as many amp models as it does, and getting the variety of sounds that I just demonstrated for the same amount of money. And you're obviously going to have to shell out quite a bit more money exponentially for a lot of the tones we just listened to, for stuff that to a lot of people is just minutia. It's not worth the cash for them. For me, a lot of the times that detail is definitely worth it, but for a lot of players it's just not. I can't recommend anyone record seriously with this thing. It's a fine demo machine. It's a fine, you know, take it to a friend's house and jam through a PA. No problem with that, and people can sound good with it. But if you're serious about it, if you want some really nice, you know, tracked sounds, you can do that with VST plugins as we've shown. And if you're looking for something that will actually compete in terms of contemporary amp modelers and age better going forward, then you know, you're just going to shell out a little bit more. But that price keeps dropping every year, which is a good thing. A lower cost of entry is only a good thing for consumers. So yeah, it did all right. I'm surprised, to tell you the truth. I figured after the honeymoon period was over, it would, you know, kind of reveal its true nature. But it's still okay. I'll definitely be keeping it around for you know, a fun little dick around with device, I guess. So that's the end of this pedal head. I don't know how many more like this we're going to do. I could foresee a pod versus pod versus pod at some point if I gather up all the models. Again, if you have any lying around that you'd like to lend out to see content on, I would definitely be down for it. I'd prefer to get my hands on an XT next, but yeah, I'm open for it. But this sort of apples versus oranges comparison is fun, but not exactly what I was hoping to achieve with this video when I first started it. But hopefully someone learned something and got some entertainment out of it either way. So that'll do it. Appreciate you watching. Any questions, comments, as always, leave them down below, and we will see you next time. Bye.